The summer of 2003 was supposed to be their last real adventure together. Four college friends, Amy Caldwell, Jenna Ruiz, Tyler Benton, and Marcus Laird, had just finished their junior year at the University of Colorado. With 1 year left before graduation and adult life creeping closer, they packed into Tyler's silver 1998 Toyota Camry and hit the road for Texas. It was meant to be spontaneous. No firm plans, just good music, back roads, and a string of cheap motels. They were last seen alive on June 6th, checking out of the Lone Star Inn near Amarillo. After that, nothing. No phone calls, no texts, no credit card activity. It was as if the desert swallowed them whole. For 2 decades, the case remained cold. The parents held vigils. Billboards with their faces faded in the sun. Every few years, a new detective would be assigned, re-interview the same people, and reach the same dead end. Until May 2023, when a crew demolishing an abandoned roadside motel near Lubbock unearthed something that changed everything. A crushed Toyota Camry buried beneath the cracked concrete of the backlot. Inside were skeletal remains, fragments of sun-bleached clothing, and 4 university ID cards. But the discovery only deepened the mystery. Why was the car buried so deliberately? Who had access to heavy equipment in a remote area like that? And why, after all these years, had no one noticed? The story began gaining national traction again, 2 decades after the disappearance. Reporters flocked to Lubbock. Amateur sleuths dug through old records and chat forums. But the more people looked, the more questions surfaced. The motel's previous owner had died in 2009. The property had sat untouched for years, and local authorities admitted that no permit had ever been filed for the paving done behind the lot. It wasn't just illegal, it was secretive. The last known image of the group was captured by a grainy gas station camera on June 5th. Amy was laughing. Jenna was leaning out the window, her long hair blowing wildly in the wind. Tyler was driving, and Marcus sat in the back with a folded map. They had paid cash for gas, snacks, and 2 cartons of cigarettes. From there, they were supposed to take I-27 south toward Lubbock. They never made it. Tyler's mother, Carol Benton, spent years calling hospitals and jails, following up on every sighting. Once, in 2007, a man claimed to have seen Marcus at a rest stop near El Paso. In 2011, a motel manager in Pecos reported a woman matching Amy's description checking in alone, but none of these leads led anywhere. And now, with the discovery of the car, families were forced to confront the unbearable truth. Their children had been close, so close, to being found all along. Yet, something didn't add up. Investigators stated that all 4 doors had been locked from the inside. The keys were in the ignition, the windows were sealed shut, and curiously, the car radio had been removed. It wasn't looted. It was methodically detached and missing entirely. Why go to such lengths to hide a car? And what happened in those final hours before the burial? Local legend tells of strange activities around that stretch of highway, lights in the distance, drifters who come and go, and unregistered construction jobs done in the dead of night. But rumors are easy to dismiss. The question now is whether the truth is buried even deeper than the car itself. As for the motel, authorities confirmed it had once been a popular stop for truckers in the 80s, but fell into disrepair by the late 90s. Multiple owners, repeated code violations, but no official complaints around the time of the disappearance. It was simply forgotten, like the 4 students who vanished that summer night, or perhaps someone wanted it that way. The motel's demolition crew wasn't supposed to dig that deep. According to the site manager, the plan was to break up the backlot and pour a fresh foundation for a gas station chain that had bought the property. But when one of the jackhammers struck metal under 3 feet of cracked concrete, the machine jammed. Curious, a worker began clearing out the rubble by hand. What he uncovered first was a corroded hubcap, Toyota brand. What followed was the unmistakable contour of a buried vehicle. Police were called within the hour. It took 6 more to unearth the entire car. A dusty tarp, wrapped tightly around the vehicle's midsection, had been used to muffle the impact and reduce shifting soil pressure. Whoever buried the car didn't do it in a panic. It had taken time, care, and knowledge of construction technique. Detectives on scene immediately knew this was no accident. The forensic team arrived under the cover of night, wanting to avoid media attention. They pried open the vehicle using hydraulic tools. The air inside was stale, dry, suffocating. Inside, skeletal remains were seated exactly as they'd last been seen in the grainy gas station video. Tyler at the wheel, Amy in the passenger seat, Marcus and Jenna in the back. All seatbelts were still fastened. The ignition was turned to the accessory position. No signs of trauma, no sign of struggle. Just silence, the eerie kind that hangs heavy in the aftermath of something irreversible. The discovery was not announced publicly for 4 more days. The authorities needed time to notify the families and confirm identities. DNA matching, dental records, and personal items left no room for doubt. Each of the 4 college students had died in that car, likely together, likely within hours of their last confirmed sighting. But how? The medical examiner ruled out carbon monoxide poisoning. No trace was present. There was no fire, no gunshots, no broken bones. The bodies were simply still. Investigators were left with what they called a containment death, a rare and poorly understood phenomenon where individuals die in enclosed environments without obvious cause. That explanation satisfied no one, least of all the parents. Lubbock County Sheriff's Office reopened the case as a homicide investigation. Detectives began reviewing property records of the Lone Star Inn and the unnamed adjacent lot where the car had been buried. The trail led them to Harold McKinnon, who had purchased both parcels in 2001. A reclusive man in his late 50s, McKinnon operated the motel with minimal staff and rarely spoke to guests. He died of a stroke in 2009 and was buried in an unmarked grave. No family, no will. Just a cluttered office full of paperwork that was never examined until now. Inside a locked filing cabinet recovered from storage, police found maintenance logs, blueprints of the motel layout, and handwritten notes dated around June 2003. One note stood out, scrawled in uneven block letters: Camry back, night, no plate, 4 inside, don't touch. It was signed only with an H. Detectives traced the handwriting to Harold using a series of old motel registration slips. But if Harold was the one who buried the car, the big question remained: why? There was no known connection between him and the students, no financial gain, no evidence of prior criminal behavior, and no surviving witnesses who could place the students at the motel. Until a woman came forward with a story no one expected. A former housekeeper at the Lone Star Inn, now living in El Paso, saw the news about the buried car and contacted authorities. Her name was Luisa Vega. In a quiet, shaking voice, she told police, "I remember the girl with the bandana. She asked me for ice. That same night, there were sounds, shouting, then nothing." Luisa Vega hadn't spoken about that night in 20 years. She was just 19 then, working under the table at the Lone Star Inn, cleaning rooms in exchange for cash and a cot in the storage closet. She said she never knew the names of the guests, only their room numbers. But she remembered the 4 college kids because they looked like they didn't belong there. They were smiling, laughing. I remember thinking they should be at a beach, not a place like this. Luisa said the girl who came to her, Amy, she believes, was polite and soft-spoken, asked for a bucket of ice, thanked her in Spanish. That was around 8 p.m. Luisa went to sleep a couple of hours later, but not before hearing raised voices outside. There was yelling, a man's voice, angry. Then someone else, maybe 2. One of them said, "You weren't supposed to stop here." I heard a car door slam. Then silence, no more talking, just that quiet feeling, like something was wrong. She didn't report it at the time. She was undocumented, afraid of being deported, so she stayed quiet until the buried Camry made the news. Her voice cracked when she described what she remembered. "I didn't see their faces again. I never heard them leave. I thought maybe they just checked out early. But now, I think I heard them die." Her testimony reignited the investigation. The authorities released an updated timeline of the night. The group had checked into room 4 at 7:32 p.m. according to the ledger. The room key was never returned. No other guests were logged in that row of rooms, but someone else had used the ice machine at 9:45 p.m. based on a mechanical log found in the maintenance records. That time frame matched Luisa's account, and then nothing. No checkout. No witness sightings, just 4 empty beds and a car that disappeared. A search of the remaining motel rubble revealed a rusted pry bar wedged behind the collapsed ice machine. Investigators believe it may have been used to pry open the trunk of the Camry. Why, they couldn't yet determine. It was sent for testing. But what puzzled detectives even more was what wasn't found. No blood, no broken glass, no physical evidence that suggested a struggle inside the room. Everything had been wiped clean, sterile, as if the room had never been occupied. Luisa's information led investigators to revisit staff records from 2003. Aside from Harold McKinnon, only 2 others had worked at the motel, a night manager named Calvin Hoyt and a part-time handyman known only as Ricky. Hoyt had passed away in 2015 in a car accident. No family, no known associates. But Ricky, real name Richard Parks, was still alive, now 63, living just outside Amarillo. When approached by detectives, he seemed startled but cooperative. "Yeah, I remember the kids," he said. "Pretty ones. Not the usual crowd. I saw them go into the room. Didn't see them come out." He claimed he hadn't thought about them in years. Said Harold told him never to ask questions when it came to guests. But when shown the handwritten note from the filing cabinet, Ricky's demeanor changed. He stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "That's not Harold's handwriting." Detectives were stunned. Ricky insisted Harold never wrote in block letters. He had a sharp, slanted cursive, looked like chicken scratches. "That's someone else." He asked to see the rest of the motel notes, and when handed them, he immediately pointed to a different page. "This one here, that's Harold. But this one, the one that says 4 inside, that's not his." When asked whose handwriting it might be, Ricky hesitated, looked down, and then said, "I think it was the guy who used to bring him things late at night. Never checked in, always parked around back. I never knew his name. We just called him the Runner." The Runner. It sounded like something out of a pulp novel. But to the investigators working the cold case, that one name opened up an entirely new avenue. Ricky described him as a man in his 40s at the time, tall, lean, always wore a ball cap low over his face. He would show up late, usually after midnight, driving a dark van with no plates. According to Ricky, he never said much. He'd nod at Harold, unload a few unmarked boxes, sometimes take an envelope back with him, and vanish again into the night. When asked what was in the boxes, Ricky shrugged. Could have been towels. Could have been something else. Harold never let me near 'em. That cryptic pattern, unregistered deliveries, after-hours meetings, and complete secrecy, suggested that the motel may have been a front for something more. Drugs, trafficking, storage. No one could say for sure, but the level of control Harold maintained, even over his own staff, was telling. Ricky recalled one night in particular, a week before the students vanished, when he spotted Harold arguing with the Runner behind the motel. They were shouting about money. Harold looked scared. That was the only time I ever saw him that way. This new lead prompted detectives to scour regional law enforcement databases for reports of unregistered vans or similar delivery patterns around Lubbock and Amarillo in the early 2000s. They came up with one match. In 2004, a dark-colored cargo van was pulled over for a busted taillight just south of Abilene. The driver, who had no ID, was let go after the officer failed to find any evidence of a crime. The officer's dashcam footage had long since been lost, but his written report described the driver as tall, white, in his 40s, wearing a faded baseball cap. He never gave a name. On the paperwork, the officer simply wrote, "Let go with warning, claimed to be a courier, runner." It was enough of a connection for detectives to begin looking deeper, but without a name, they needed something physical to tie this mystery man to the buried Camry. That's when the lab called back with results on the pry bar found behind the old ice machine. It had a partial fingerprint, not enough for a direct match, but enough to link it to a set of prints lifted from a series of storage unit break-ins in New Mexico in 2006. Those crimes had never been solved. The suspect, caught briefly on surveillance video, had never been identified, but he had the same build, the same ball cap. And in one frame, the back of his van bore a distinctive sticker, faded but just legible, Chandler Supply Co. That company, detectives discovered, had gone out of business in 2002. It was a hardware distributor with a warehouse just 20 miles from the Lone Star Inn. Records showed that Harold McKinnon had received regular deliveries from them for nearly 3 years before the company folded. And the final delivery was signed not by Harold, but by someone listed only as J. Teague. That was the break they needed. Using old employment and business records, they tracked down a man named Joseph Teague, who had worked as an independent contractor for Chandler Supply in the early 2000s. But he hadn't been seen in years, no current address, no driver's license renewals, nothing. It was as if he too had vanished. In a final attempt to locate him, detectives issued a quiet bolo, "Be on the lookout," for anyone fitting his description. Days passed. Then in a rural scrapyard outside San Angelo, a state trooper came across a man living in an abandoned RV behind piles of rusted metal, no ID, no plates, a faded Chandler Supply sticker on the bumper. When asked for his name, the man hesitated, then said, "It's Joe Teague." Why? Joe Teague didn't put up a fight. He didn't run or ask questions. When the troopers told him they needed him to come in for questioning, he simply nodded and climbed into the back of the cruiser, his boots leaving dusty prints on the metal floorboard. He looked older than expected, sun-leathered skin, deep lines around his eyes, and a grey beard that hadn't been trimmed in months. But his eyes were sharp, watchful, like he'd been waiting for this moment, or perhaps knew it would come eventually. At the station, investigators laid out what they had: the handwritten note from the filing cabinet, the Chandler Supply connection, the fingerprint from the pry bar, and finally, Louisa Vega's account of the late-night shouting the night the students disappeared. Teague remained quiet through most of it, only blinking slowly as each photo was laid in front of him. When they reached the part about the buried car, his fingers twitched slightly, but he said nothing. For hours he maintained the same stance, arms crossed, eyes down, barely reacting. Then one of the detectives made a calculated move. He slid a grainy, enlarged photo across the table. It was from the 2006 New Mexico storage unit break-in. In it, the silhouette of a man in a ball cap stood beside a van with the Chandler Supply sticker visible in the corner. "We know it's you, Joe," the detective said. "You were there. You were connected to Harold McKinnon. We just want to know what happened that night." Joe stared at the image for nearly a full minute. Then finally he spoke. "You think I buried that car?" The detective leaned forward. "Did you?" Teague didn't answer directly. Instead, he said something that sent chills down the room. That place wasn't just a motel. It was a gate. Things came in and didn't always come out the same. The investigators exchanged puzzled glances. Was this a confession or deflection? Joe leaned back in his chair, looking suddenly very tired. "I brought Harold things. Yes. Sometimes equipment, sometimes packages. I didn't ask. He didn't tell. When asked what happened the night of June 6, 2003, Joe grew quiet again. "I don't know what he did, but I remember driving by the back lot a day later. There was a smell. You don't forget a smell like that. And there were drag marks, fresh concrete. I never asked him about it. Didn't want to know. He insisted he wasn't the one who buried the car. I didn't lay a hand on them kids, I swear it. But he admitted he had been to the motel that night. Dropped something off. A box. Same as always. Harold met me out back. He looked different. Pale. Sweating. Said I needed to go. Now. When pressed on what was in the box, Joe paused. It wasn't mine to open, but it was heavy. Real heavy. Joe's testimony, partial, strange, evasive, was enough to keep him in custody for further questioning, but not enough to charge him. However, one thing stood out. When asked if he'd ever seen anyone else at the motel who wasn't a guest or employee, he mentioned a man who'd appeared a few times in the months before the disappearance. Tall, real clean, always had a clipboard. Drove a state vehicle, I think. Government plates. I figured he was an inspector or something. But no records showed any inspections scheduled during that time. No names matched the description, and Joe couldn't recall a name, just a detail. He wore gloves, every time, even when it was 100 degrees outside. Then, as Joe was being returned to his holding cell, he said something unprompted, almost like a whisper to himself. They weren't supposed to stop there. That's what Harold kept saying, over and over. They weren't supposed to stop here. The phrase echoed in the minds of the investigators long after Joe Teague was returned to his cell. They weren't supposed to stop here. What did that mean? Was it a simple expression of regret? Or did it suggest something deeper, something premeditated? Detective Laura Jensen, the lead on the reopened case, began combing through every aspect of the students' route. The group had started in Boulder, Colorado, and planned to reach Austin by June 8th. Their last confirmed stop was a gas station outside Amarillo on June 5th, but the Lone Star Inn wasn't along the direct route. It sat 6 miles off I-27, hidden behind a line of trees and a rusting billboard that hadn't been readable in years. It was the kind of place you only found if you were looking for something cheap, or if you got lost. Jensen dug into cell tower pings from the last known movements of Tyler's phone. The signal had dropped off entirely at 8:16 p.m. On June 6th, roughly 45 minutes after check-in, that was the last digital trace from any of the 4 students. Their phones never reconnected to a tower. It was as if the motel had become a black hole. Even stranger, a thorough scan of utility records showed that the Lone Star Inn had a brief power outage between 8 and 9 p.m. that night. According to the electric company, a manual breaker trip had occurred at the motel's junction box, shutting off power to all rooms except the office. That kind of action would have required physical access, likely by someone with keys or tools. Jensen and her team returned to the site. Though the buildings had already been torn down, they brought ground-penetrating radar to scan the lot, searching for anything else buried beneath the surface. Near the far corner of the property, behind where Room 4 once stood, they found a cluster of irregular shapes buried about 5 feet down. The dig revealed rusted metal, torn insulation, and the remnants of a walk-in freezer, one that hadn't been listed on any blueprints or inspection records. It had been sealed shut from the outside with welded iron bars. Who installs a freezer behind a motel room? And why go to such lengths to hide it? The unit was pulled up and transported to a forensic facility for analysis. Inside were scratches on the inner walls, long and erratic. No bodies, no items. Just cold emptiness and the faint scent of mildew and rust. But something about the shape of the door stood out to Jensen. It had been reinforced, thicker than standard, and on the inside, etched into the condensation-scarred metal, were 4 sets of initials. AC, JR, ML, and TB. It was a gut punch. The initials of Amy Caldwell, Jenna Ruiz, Marcus Laird, and Tyler Benton. It was the first time any direct mark from them had been found since the gas station footage. Someone, maybe all of them, had been inside that freezer. Whether it was before or after their deaths remained unclear, but the implication was undeniable. They had been held, at least briefly, in that hidden structure. Detectives expanded their search beyond the motel lot, scouring old aerial photos from early 2003 to identify changes in the terrain. One image, taken in April of that year, showed a large dark patch behind the motel, roughly the same area where the freezer was found. But in the photo dated July, the patch was gone, replaced by a neatly paved concrete slab. No record of construction. No contractor reports, just sudden alteration. At this point, the FBI was formally brought in, citing the potential for interstate criminal activity. They took possession of all motel documents, including a partially burned ledger found in a safe deposit box registered under Harold McKinnon's name. Inside was a single page dated June 6, 2003, listing one handwritten line: Room 4 comped. No charge. Guest of G. Guest of G. It was a vague phrase, meaningless on its own, but to federal investigators it opened a new corridor of speculation. Who was G? A first name? A code name? A reference to an agency, a group, a singular individual with enough authority or fear attached to warrant free lodging and a handwritten note in Harold McKinnon's private ledger? The FBI analysts combed through every page of that scorched book, and patterns began to emerge. Most guests were listed by room number and payment type: credit card, cash, or voucher. But 9 other entries, scattered over the course of 3 years, were labeled only as comped, with various letters beside them. Guest of H, guest of R, and now the final one, guest of G. Only a few matched known names. R was most likely Ricky, the handyman. H could have been Harold himself. But G remained elusive. Complicating matters, those particular rooms, when cross-referenced with the log, often showed no cleaning records, no linen swaps, no maintenance notes. It was as if the rooms were never used, or never cleaned after being used. One anomaly stood out. A booking in March 2002, Room 6, Guest of G, matched the date of a missing persons report filed in Amarillo that same week. A woman named Clarissa Pine had vanished while driving to meet her brother in Dallas. Her vehicle was later found abandoned behind a truck stop off I-27. She was never seen again. Her case had remained unsolved for over 20 years, until now. Amy Caldwell's mother, Lorraine, was informed of the development. She had been the most outspoken of the 4 families, never missing an anniversary, pushing for news coverage long after the public lost interest. Now, staring at the initials scratched inside the freezer and hearing about mysterious ledger entries, she asked the same question the investigators were asking. Was this a one-time tragedy or part of something much bigger? FBI profilers began examining Harold McKinnon's past. Not just his time as a motel owner, but the years before that. They discovered he had once worked for a private construction firm that subcontracted for multiple government agencies in the late 80s and early 90s. Most of the projects were mundane: road expansions, storm drain infrastructure, but one job, listed only as Facility WTX-27, had been sealed by the Department of Energy. No location, no blueprints, no clear purpose, just a code name and McKinnon's signature as a site lead. When the agents requested access to those records, they hit a wall: national security clearance required. Redacted pages, dead ends. One former co-worker, now living in Arizona, agreed to speak anonymously. Harold was smart, he said. Quiet. Too quiet. He knew how to build things that didn't leave a trace. He got pulled into some hush-hush stuff near Lubbock back then. After that, he quit construction and vanished for a year. Next thing we knew, he was running that motel. The possibility that the Lone Star Inn was more than a rundown roadside lodge began gaining weight. If McKinnon had both the skills and contacts to build hidden rooms, bury cars, and seal freezers into the earth, what else had he built? A search team was dispatched to the now leveled property with orders to scan for substructures. After days of excavation, they found a sealed hatch beneath what had once been the laundry shed. It was bolted shut with industrial-grade steel, no hinges visible. No markings, just a single rusted handle flush with the concrete slab. When they finally cracked it open, what they saw wasn't dirt, it was stairs leading down. The stairwell was narrow and steep, descending into total blackness. Dust clung to every surface. The air grew colder with each step, thick with the scent of mold, iron, and something metallic beneath. The agents moved slowly, flashlights sweeping side to side, revealing walls of poured concrete lined with rusted pipes. It wasn't a basement, it was a tunnel. 15 feet below ground, it curved sharply to the left and continued in silence for nearly 20 yards. Then they found the first door. Steel, unmarked, bolted from the outside. It took 2 agents and a crowbar to force it open. Inside was a small, windowless room, no more than 10 feet by 10. The walls were bare. The floor was stained. A single hook hung from the ceiling. In the corner, a discarded mattress, its fabric torn and yellowed with age. There were no cameras, no recording equipment, but the intention behind the room was unmistakable. Isolation, detainment, possibly worse. The agents found 3 more rooms like it, each one identical, each one sealed from the outside. In the final chamber, there was something different. A metal folding chair sat in the center of the room, facing a small wooden table. On that table, a plastic cassette recorder. Next to it, a stack of blank tapes, except for one. It was labeled in black marker 6603R4, room 4, the date of the student's disappearance. The agents bagged the cassette and immediately sent it for forensic preservation before attempting playback. While that process unfolded, the FBI sealed off the entire site. News of the underground bunker leaked almost instantly, triggering national media attention. The term Texas Motel Dungeon began trending within hours. Families of other missing persons began calling investigators, convinced their loved ones had passed through that stretch of highway. Suddenly, it wasn't just about 4 college kids. It was about the possibility of something larger, an operation that had been buried and forgotten beneath the dust of West Texas for decades. Meanwhile, the forensic team began analyzing the cassette. It had degraded over time, warped slightly from heat and age. But after several hours, a partial recording was recovered. The audio was faint, muffled, filled with static, but voices could be heard. Multiple. A female voice panicked. "Please, why are we here?" A male voice, tense, whispering, "Don't talk, don't say anything else." Then silence. Then a sound, a click, like a door locking, followed by footsteps. Then another voice. This one deeper, calm. "Room 4, I told you to keep driving." The rest of the tape was unintelligible. But the effect on investigators was immediate. Someone had recorded at least a portion of the students' final hours. It confirmed they were moved underground. It confirmed they had been held. But who was the third voice, and why did it sound composed? The FBI returned to their records on Harold McKinnon's associates. One name surfaced repeatedly in the construction contracts from the late 80s, Gerald Strickland. A logistics coordinator turned site manager, Strickland had worked closely with McKinnon on sealed installations. But while Harold left public records after opening the motel, Strickland had simply disappeared. No tax filings after 1994, no death certificate, no relatives, just a P.O. box in Odessa that had remained open until 2005, 2 years after the disappearance. Strickland's signature appeared next to McKinnon's on 5 classified project blueprints, all tied to facilities in the Texas Panhandle. When agents attempted to access those documents, they were denied under a national security exemption. It was the first time in the investigation federal clearance had blocked access. Whatever had happened under the Lone Star Inn was now bumping up against something bigger, something protected, something that didn't want to be uncovered. But then, late one night, Agent Jensen received an anonymous email. No subject line, no sender traceable, just one sentence. Strickland's still alive, and he's watching. The email rattled Agent Jensen. There was no IP to trace, no origin point, just a dead-end relay server bouncing through multiple countries. Whoever had sent it knew what they were doing. And more importantly, they knew the FBI was getting close. Jensen ordered a full background investigation into Gerald Strickland, digging deeper than before. Military records showed he had once served in Army intelligence during the early 80s, specializing in logistics for off-book operations. After his discharge, he joined a series of private contractors that handled sensitive construction, a euphemism often used for facilities the government didn't officially acknowledge. His name came up in audits linked to emergency bunkers, isolated communications hubs, and one curious note in a heavily redacted file. Containment Architecture Approved, GS. That file was tied to a 1991 project near Amarillo. The coordinates were blacked out. The budget $14 million. The structure unknown. McKinnon was listed as the lead site engineer. This was more than a coincidence. But then came the biggest break. A whistleblower, retired Air Force intelligence, name withheld, contacted the Bureau after hearing about the buried car on the news. He told investigators that in the early 2000s he'd been briefed about a decommissioned structure converted for asset control. When pressed, he clarified, "You'd use it if someone needed to disappear temporarily or permanently. It wasn't official, and it wasn't legal." He couldn't confirm if it was the Lone Star Inn, but his description matched the terrain, the dimensions, and the access tunnel. He also mentioned something that had never been reported publicly, that the facility's layout included an acoustic chamber with ceiling restraints. Just like the underground freezer and rooms found beneath the motel, the agent tasked with analyzing the anonymous cassette took the tape into a sound lab for deeper filtering. After stripping layers of noise, he uncovered something chilling beneath the final moments of the recording, a low-frequency hum. Not machine noise, not environmental. It was rhythmic, pulsing, as if something had been transmitting, either inside the room or just beneath it. The frequency matched no known devices, but bore similarities to early signal jammers used by the military in closed installations. If that hum had been active during the time the students were held, it could explain the complete communication blackout. No cell service, no radio signal, no escape. The focus returned to Strickland, a known associate of McKinnon, experienced in covert site management, and now possibly still alive. Investigators circulated facial composites to shelters, clinics, and unregistered communities across Texas and New Mexico. Then, at a roadside diner just outside Roswell, a waitress made a call. An older man had come in 3 nights in a row, never ordered much, always sat facing the door, wore gloves even when eating, paid in cash, never talked, but he'd left behind a folded receipt with a name scrawled on the back. Jensen. Agent Jensen drove out personally. The man was gone, but the diner had security footage. There he was, taller than Harold, lean with white hair and a face that looked carved from stone. He wore a dark windbreaker and jeans, no fingerprints on the glass, no traceable vehicle, but under magnification, analysts spotted something clipped to his belt, a small black pager, obsolete technology, except in one very specific world, facilities still running legacy comms systems on isolated loops. Some bunkers still use them, not for messages, but for triggers, and then came the message, this time in a white envelope, slid under the front door of Jensen's motel room. No return address, no postmark. Inside was a single photo. 4 young people standing in front of a car, smiling. Amy, Jenna, Marcus, Tyler. On the back, written in block letters, "Not the first, not the last." Agent Jensen stared at the photo, her hands trembling slightly as she turned it over again. The image was crisp, unnaturally so, developed with professional equipment, not the kind used for casual snapshots. The 4 students were smiling, unaware, standing in front of the Toyota Camry. The timestamp in the corner was a detail only she would notice immediately. June 6, 2003, 6:43 p.m., exactly 49 minutes before they checked in at the Lone Star Inn. This photo had never been released to the public, which meant whoever had taken it had been watching them before they vanished, and whoever had left it under her door had access not only to surveillance, but to her exact location. The implications were staggering. Security around Jensen was immediately tightened. The bureau swept the motel. No prints, no cameras caught anyone entering or exiting. Whoever delivered the envelope did so cleanly, with precision, just like the burial of the car, just like the sealing of the underground rooms. Deliberate, controlled, almost clinical. It was starting to feel like someone was always 2 steps ahead. With pressure mounting, the FBI reopened several unsolved missing persons cases from the early 2000s along the I-27 corridor. They found patterns, young travelers, often passing through Texas, last seen near small motels or rest stops, then vanishing without a trace. No violence, no calls for help. Just silence. Some were written off as runaways. Others became cold cases. But when Jensen compared their final locations to historical data, she found something horrifying. Nearly all of them had made purchases, gas, snacks, or lodging within a 60-mile radius of the Lone Star Inn. The motel, it seemed, had not been chosen at random. It had been strategically placed, positioned like bait. The question now wasn't just who had taken those students, but why. That's when a new lead came in. A man named Everett Case, a retired private contractor, contacted the Bureau after seeing a story on the news. He claimed he had once worked on a quiet project in 1999, a soundproof containment structure buried under a utility shed west of Lubbock. He didn't know what it was for. "We were told to pour the concrete, reinforce the doors, and stay quiet, paid in cash. No blueprints, no questions." He'd never seen Harold or Strickland, but remembered a third man overseeing the job. Quiet, commanding, always wore gloves. "He said the place was for behavioral testing," Everett said. "But I always had the feeling it wasn't for volunteers." Jensen showed Everett the diner photo. He went pale. "That's him. That's the guy. But he looked younger back then." Same eyes, though. Cold. Now they had a possible physical match and witness confirmation tying this unknown man, likely Strickland, to the underground compound. But why continue watching now? What purpose did the photo serve? Warning? Control? Guilt? Or was it something darker, like a breadcrumb meant to lure them into a deeper maze? The Bureau's psychological profiler stepped in. His theory was unsettling. This man doesn't see himself as a criminal. He sees himself as a custodian, a protector of something we don't yet understand. The bunker, the procedures, the recordings, they were ritualized, structured. He's not killing randomly. He's enacting a process. What kind of process requires silence, disappearance, and perfectly buried cars? No one could say, but then just as the profiler was reviewing the photo again, he noticed something in the background, barely visible between Amy and Marcus. A structure, a silhouette of another motel. Not the Lone Star Inn. Something older. The sign was mostly cropped out, but one letter was visible in red neon. E. The team enhanced the image, zoomed in. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. And in the Bureau's old files, one closed report from 1997 mentioned that exact motel, abandoned after a string of unexplained disappearances. Its name, the Eldridge Motor Lodge. The Eldridge Motor Lodge had been shuttered for over 25 years. Located 70 miles northwest of the Lone Star Inn, it sat like a decaying skeleton on the outskirts of a forgotten service road. The property had passed through 5 owners since its closure, each one defaulting or walking away without explanation. Locals whispered that the place was cursed. Teens dared each other to sneak in after dark, but most wouldn't get past the front gate. Something about it felt wrong. The Bureau dispatched a field team early the next morning, arriving just after sunrise. The building's facade was crumbling, its sign twisted and rusted, the red E barely hanging on by a bolt. Overgrown weeds consumed the parking lot, and graffiti covered the faded brick walls. But the inside told a different story. The lobby was coated in dust, yes, but it was undisturbed. No broken furniture, no rodents, no signs of vagrants. It felt preserved, like someone was keeping it exactly as it was. Room keys still hung behind the front desk, labelled in neat handwriting. A guest logbook sat open on the counter, its last entry dated July 15th, 1997. And beneath that logbook, in the drawer, was something even more chilling. A thin manila envelope labelled simply 4G. Inside were black and white photographs, 7 in total, all of young adults, some smiling, some candid. One showed a girl standing on the hood of a car with her arms outstretched, another a couple sitting by a gas station. None of the individuals were ever identified publicly, but facial recognition software would later confirm that 5 of them matched names from unsolved missing persons cases in the region, disappearances dating back to 1992. On the back of each photo were initials and dates, all of them pre-2000, all of them ending in a short red slash mark, like a tally or a signature. The agents continued through the building room by room. Each appeared untouched, beds neatly made, bathrooms dry. But then they reached room 9. The door was locked and, unlike the others, its number was scratched out completely. They forced it open. Inside was a single wooden chair, facing the wall. A hole had been punched through the drywall near the ceiling, revealing what looked like a hidden conduit, wiring thick and insulated, running somewhere behind the wall. And on that wall, scrawled faintly in pencil, were dozens of names, some first names, others just initials. At the bottom of the list, written larger than the others, was one word: excited. The wiring led the agents to a sealed panel in the floor beneath the bed frame. It took nearly an hour to pry it open, but what they found was familiar. A narrow shaft leading downward, like the tunnel beneath the Lone Star Inn. Another subterranean space. Another secret. The team descended cautiously, this time prepared. But what they found wasn't a corridor of rooms. It was a circular chamber, concrete walls, ceiling 12 feet high, and in the center a single podium. On it sat a dusty reel-to-reel recorder. Next to it, a notebook. The first few pages were blank. Then, in tight, almost surgical handwriting, it began, "This is the process. Silence is the beginning. The body is the vessel. Observation must remain unbroken. All others must be removed." They were warned. The deeper the agents read, the more the entries devolved into cryptic phrases, references to phase cycles and threshold events. It wasn't a confession, it was a doctrine, a belief system, one built around disappearance as purification. At the very end of the notebook, a final line: "The next test arrives 6 to 6:23, the same date the buried Camry was uncovered, 2 decades to the day." It wasn't a coincidence, it was a clock, and something or someone was keeping time. The revelation of a date, June 6, 2023, was more than symbolic. It suggested orchestration, planning, and most disturbingly, intent. Whoever had written those words inside the Eldridge Motor Lodge notebook had not only tracked the 20-year anniversary of the college student's disappearance, but had seemingly anticipated the unearthing of the Camry itself, which meant they were still watching, still waiting, still active. The FBI formed a joint task force with local and state authorities, combing through every known structure connected to Harold McKinnon and Gerald Strickland. The phrase phase cycles appeared to reference timed events, patterns of behavior repeated across decades. Analysts began plotting every known disappearance, property sale, permit request, and buried structure across a 5-county radius. The map that formed was startling. At least 6 separate facilities had been identified with architectural similarities. Hidden stairwells, underground rooms, soundproof chambers. 4 had been fully demolished. 2 remained unsearched. 1 was located deep in the Llano Estacado, hidden beneath the ruins of a church that burned down in 1985. The other, a seemingly abandoned grain silo 40 miles outside Amarillo, had been purchased in 1996 by a shell company traced to a now-defunct logistics firm. The name on the paperwork, G. Strickland. A team was sent to the grain silo first. From the outside, it was unremarkable. Weathered aluminum, cracked concrete, wind-whipped fencing. But inside, behind a welded panel near the storage chute, agents found a hatch bolted shut with an electromagnetic lock. The power to the entire building had been disconnected for years, yet somehow the lock responded to a pulse scanner brought by the forensic unit. The hatch released with a hiss. Below, another staircase. Another silence. The air smelled of ammonia and oil, and the descent felt colder than it should have, as if the ground itself had been holding its breath for years. At the base, the passageway opened into a rectangular room with clean white walls, unlike the concrete corridors of the other sites. This one had been designed with precision, modern, intentional. Surveillance cameras were mounted in each corner. Red standby lights blinked. Power was still flowing from an unseen source, but there was no generator above ground, no lines leading in. And on the far wall, a phrase had been painted in grey stencil letters: "Control is proof of order." In the center of the room stood a steel table, surgical in design. On it lay dozens of small black plastic boxes, each numbered, each sealed. An FBI tech carefully opened the first one. Inside was a set of tapes, miniature reels, labeled not with names, but with alphanumeric codes. When run through a preserved playback device, the recordings were more coherent than the cassette from the motel. The voices were clearer. They captured isolated conversations, whispers, pleas, breathing. Some lasted seconds, others stretched into hours. The last tape, marked R46J03 Fin, contained the sound of a door slamming shut, then silence, then a single breath, then a voice that none of the agents expected to hear. "We're still here, please. If anyone hears this." The voice was unmistakable. It was Amy Caldwell, a full 20 years after her disappearance. The audio ended abruptly, but its impact was seismic. It suggested that the tapes had not only been archived but reviewed, stored, and preserved with purpose. The task force now had to confront the unthinkable possibility. At least one of the students may have survived longer than previously believed. If so, where were they taken next? Why had only bones been found in the car? And who had decided what was left behind? Back at headquarters, Agent Jensen's inbox received another email. No subject, no sender, just one line. "The next test is early. 9:14 to 25, Silo 2. The new message struck like a siren in the night. "The next test is early. 9:14:25, Silo 2. The timing was no longer theoretical. The countdown wasn't decades away. It was now. September 14th, 2025, just days from when the grain silo discovery had taken place. Jensen's team was forced into action. What was Silo 2? If the grain structure they had just entered was Silo 1, where was the second? The task force pulled every property deed, logistics manifest, and zoning permit registered under Strickland, McKinnon, or the shell companies tied to them. And buried in a stack of county archives, they found it, another silo listed under TXAG Export Holdings, registered in 1998. Located near an old rail line just outside of Plainview, it had sat undisturbed for nearly 25 years. The satellite images told a chilling story, minor changes in the gravel layout every few years, always in a circular pattern. A single truck seen parked there briefly in June of 2023. No other movement, but something or someone had been maintaining the perimeter. The Bureau deployed 2 teams to the site under cover of darkness. They approached cautiously, not knowing if they were walking into a crime scene or a trap. The silo's upper chamber was coated in dust, but the floor was strangely clean in the center, as if something had recently been moved. A faint humming sound pulsed from beneath the steel grate in the center of the floor. A metal chain had been clipped to a hidden latch. They pulled. The grate opened with effort. Below, another descent into the unknown. This shaft was narrower than the first, and deeper, 30 feet at least. It led to a sealed metal door with a biometric lockpad long since worn down. But someone had left the access panel removed, exposing wires. The Bureau's tech specialists bypassed it in under 10 minutes. The door opened with a deep mechanical groan. Lights flickered on automatically as they stepped through. The space beyond was sterile, windowless, lined with white tiles and humming ventilation ducts. But what stopped the agents cold were the rows of doors, 12 in total, each labeled with a code, S2A through S2L, each one locked with both a passcode and a physical deadbolt. They opened the first. Inside was a cot, a sink, a chair. Minimal furnishings, but clean, sanitized. On the wall, a speaker. No visible camera, but the presence was unmistakable. It felt watched. Each room was identical, perfectly controlled, and in one of them, S2G, was something the agents weren't prepared to find. A pair of shoes, women's shoes, dusty but worn recently, tucked beneath the bed, wrapped in an old t-shirt, was a notebook. Inside were dozens of entries. Some were mundane, lists of meals, temperature changes, sketches of the walls, but others were unmistakably personal. Day 16. The lights flickered again. I think they're watching from above. And later. Day 32. I heard a voice in the next room. Male. I called out. He stopped. The handwriting matched previous samples from Amy Caldwell's dorm notebooks, archived by her family after her disappearance. Jensen couldn't believe it. Somehow she had been here, alive, writing, counting days. But the entries stopped at day 47. No explanation, no final note, just a blank page, no further evidence of how she left the room, or if she ever did. But the t-shirt she wrapped around the journal had a faint logo on it, a gas station chain from New Mexico. The kind that only operated in the early 2000s. It hadn't existed in years, which meant someone had kept it with them, carried it, preserved it, perhaps as a token or a reminder. As the agents continued searching the final rooms, room S2L refused to open. The keypad was dead, the bolt rusted shut. But on the door, scratched faintly into the metal, was a single word: observe. The word observe, etched into the door of room S2L, didn't look recent. The grooves were faded, the edges smoothed by time. But the message was deliberate. It wasn't a tag or vandalism. It was a command, or perhaps a label. The FBI agents worked carefully to breach the rusted door. A small hydraulic jack finally cracked the hinges loose. As the door opened, a wave of cold air escaped, stale and unmoving. The room beyond was not like the others. It was darker, deeper, sunken, slightly below floor level. The walls were black instead of white, lined with strips of copper wiring and what looked like acoustic foam. At the center of the room was a chair, plain metal, bolted to the floor. Mounted directly in front of it was a narrow window, maybe 3 feet across, made of thick glass. But the window didn't look outside. It looked inward, into another space, another sealed room, visible only through the glass. And in that chamber, lit by a dim yellow bulb, sat another chair, empty, facing forward. The symmetry was unsettling. A chair to sit in, a chair to watch, an observer and a subject, no notes, no camera, no explanation. Jensen stared through the glass and felt a deep chill crawl down her spine. The bulb inside the second chamber flickered, just once. Then again. "Power's coming from somewhere," one agent muttered, checking the live wires along the baseboard. But the wiring didn't lead up or out. It snaked down, beneath the floor. Whatever system was powering this silo was hidden even deeper. The notebook found in room S2G had mentioned voices. "A man," Amy had written, "calm, precise, never speaks more than 5 words, says he's watching for results." No other context, no identity. But the language mirrored the words found in the Eldridge notebook. Observation must remain unbroken. Jensen suspected room S2L was where it happened, where the watching occurred. But what had they been watching for? Behavior? Breakdown? Suffering? There was no blood, no restraints. But the psychological weight of that configuration, the enforced gaze, was heavy. In the far corner of S2L, they found another hatch, smaller, unlocked. Inside was a vertical shaft no wider than a laundry chute. A ladder led down. No sound came from below, just darkness. Jensen hesitated, then descended. At the bottom she entered a chamber unlike any seen before. It was circular, domed, the walls coated in graphite paint, designed to absorb both light and sound. It was entirely silent, no echo, no hum, a true dead zone. And in the center sat a console, old, analog, covered in switches, dials, and a small blinking green light. The only sound was a faint whir from deep behind the wall. Jensen flipped the nearest switch. Nothing. Then another. A hum built, faint and rising. A click. A small speaker crackled to life. Then a voice, slow, robotic, but unmistakably human. "You've seen too much." The speaker went silent. Then the green light turned red. The floor beneath the console gave a sudden metallic groan. The agents above shouted down as Jensen backed away. Something was moving. A section of the wall split open vertically, revealing a passage, narrow and metallic, lined with handrails and blinking red indicators. The tunnel led forward, straight and endless. Jensen radioed for backup, but the signal was gone. Scrambled. Just static. A voice echoed again, this time directly from the tunnel's embedded speaker. "Proceed alone. The test requires one." Every instinct told her to run, but the case had crossed the line between investigation and design. Someone had built this to be found. Someone was still running it, and now Jensen was inside the heart of it. As she stepped forward into the tunnel, the door behind her sealed shut with a hiss. The door behind Jensen sealed so tightly she could hear the pressurized hiss echoing down the tunnel. She was alone now. No signal, no radio contact, no backup. The only light came from the pulsing red strips embedded in the curved walls, casting long shadows that swayed slightly as she moved forward. The air was thin, cool, sterile. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt maintained, purposeful. Ahead, the corridor narrowed and curved, dipping slightly before opening into a dome-shaped chamber. Inside was silence, true, heavy silence, the kind that presses into your ears and slows your heartbeat. A single object sat in the center of the room, a tall black pedestal with a recessed square in the middle. Jensen approached cautiously. At first glance, the recess looked empty. Then the light shifted and she saw it, a small cube, dark glass, about the size of a fist. As she leaned in, a dim red light blinked from inside it. Suddenly a voice, different from the last, sounded through the chamber, female, clear, calm. "This is not where it ends." Jensen stepped back. The pedestal rotated slowly, revealing a panel on its rear. Etched into the steel was a list of dates, dozens of them. The earliest was 1982, the latest was September 14th, 2025. Today, the dates weren't labeled, no names, just the heading above them, observed compliance. She pulled out her phone, not to call for help, there was no signal, but to snap photos, documentation. But as soon as she raised it, the cube pulsed red again, and the voice returned. "Recording is restricted. Your presence is the record." The implication unsettled her. The system was aware. It was watching in real time. She was no longer investigating an abandoned facility. She was inside an active protocol. She backed away toward the tunnel, but the entrance had vanished, sealed entirely with no visible seam. Then came the hum, low and steady, like a machine awakening. Panels along the walls lit up, displaying data, waveforms, heat signatures, a human silhouette labeled Subject 112B, active. It was her vitals, her posture, her blinking pattern. The system was tracking everything, monitoring not just movement, but stress, response, breath rate. This was the test. It wasn't meant for Amy Caldwell, or Jenna, or any of the college students, or maybe it was. But it had evolved. This wasn't just disappearance, it was study, preservation, controlled exposure. The voice returned, softer now. "We required their silence, we require your response." Jensen tried every angle of the chamber, every wall panel. No give, no exit. The pedestal lit again, this time showing a projection. A brief, flickering image of 4 figures seated in a small room. Amy, Jenna, Tyler, Marcus. They weren't screaming, they weren't bound, they were still, observed. Then the image faded, replaced by a question projected on the far wall. Is memory a prison or a bridge? It made no sense. It wasn't part of any known psychological experiment. And yet, it felt rehearsed, coded, like a mantra she wasn't meant to understand, only react to. She spoke, uncertain. A bridge. The hum stopped. The red light turned green. A click sounded behind her as part of the wall slid open, revealing a new tunnel, longer, darker. She hesitated, then stepped through. The door closed silently behind her. The floor here was smoother, colder. This wasn't concrete anymore. It was something else. Polished, seamless. The air smelled different, sanitized. And ahead, maybe 20 feet away, was another door. This one had a window. As she approached, her breath caught. On the other side of the glass, in a stark white room, sat a woman on the floor, pale, thin, barefoot. Her head turned slowly, her eyes locked with Jensen's. Then, with a trembling hand, she reached up and wrote a single word on the fogged glass. Amy. Jensen froze. The woman on the other side of the glass had sunken cheeks, brittle hair, and a face lined with exhaustion. But her eyes, wide and unmistakably blue, matched every photograph Jensen had ever seen of Amy Caldwell. 20 years had changed her, but it was her, alive, moving, conscious. Amy pressed her hand flat against the window, her lips forming words Jensen couldn't hear. The room was sealed, her voice lost in the barrier. Jensen searched for an intercom, a panel, any way to respond, but found nothing. The control systems must have been hidden elsewhere. Amy pointed to the corner of the room, then to the ceiling, then placed both hands flat against the glass again. Her movements were slow but deliberate. She wasn't panicked. She was signaling something, routine, maybe even rehearsed. Jensen raised a hand and placed it against the window. For a moment, they just looked at each other, disbelief shared silently. Then Amy mouthed three distinct words. "He is here." Jensen's skin went cold. She turned, instinctively checking the corridor behind her. Empty. Silent. But somehow, not still. The hum from earlier had returned, softer now, almost indistinct. As if it were hiding behind the walls. She turned back to Amy, who pointed again, more urgently this time toward the floor, miming a twisting motion with her hands. Jensen scanned the hallway. About 10 feet back from the window, partially recessed in the wall, was a small access hatch, unlabeled, flush with the steel. She pried it open and found a panel of analog switches, some of them blinking. A tiny screen read, "Observation mode active. Pod 1. Below that, manual override, key required." Jensen cursed under her breath. No key, no release. She turned back to Amy, who now looked away suddenly, toward the far corner of her cell. Her entire posture changed, her shoulders tensed, her hands dropped to her sides. Jensen followed her gaze, but could see nothing inside the room from that angle. Then the lighting in the chamber dimmed automatically. Another section of the hallway lit up ahead of Jensen. A panel slid open to reveal a new corridor, curved and gleaming, like the inside of a medical facility. No dust, no rust. A stark contrast to the bunker above. Jensen stepped cautiously into the corridor, boots echoing faintly as she passed closed doors marked with symbols instead of numbers, circles, triangles, downward arrows. Then she stopped. A sound. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, coming from a chamber just ahead. The door had no window, just a small speaker grill. She stepped closer. "Agent Jensen," a voice said, male, calm, collected. "You shouldn't be here yet." Her throat tightened. "Who are you?" The voice did not answer her question. Instead it said, "Amy is awake because you arrived. You've changed the sequence. Do you understand the consequence of that?" "Where are the others?" she demanded. "The other students, what happened to them?" A long pause. Then, "They completed the process. Amy did not. She was retained." "Why?" "Because she is the most valuable." The hallway lights flickered. Amy's window, visible just behind her now, had gone dark. The glass was no longer transparent, opaque, shielded. Jensen rushed back to the observation door and pounded against it, but the room was sealed once again. The panel screen now read, "Pod 1, observation concluded." She shouted for Amy. No response. The speaker crackled again. "You've seen what remains. You must choose. Continue observation, or become part of it." Then another voice entered the channel, female, soft, shaky. "Don't let them close it again." Jensen spun around. The voice wasn't in her earpiece. It was coming from behind her, echoing down the hallway, and when she turned, she saw the silhouette of another figure standing at the far end, thin, pale, barefoot. It wasn't Amy. It was someone else. The silhouette at the end of the corridor stepped forward slowly, her bare feet making no sound against the smooth floor. Her arms were thin, her hospital gown tattered and stained, and her hair hung in tangled strands across her face. Jensen instinctively reached for her sidearm, but stopped halfway. This woman, whoever she was, didn't move like a threat. She moved like someone who hadn't walked freely in a very long time. The woman looked up. Her face, gaunt and pale, was unfamiliar to Jensen, but it carried the same haunted expression Amy had worn through the window. The woman paused, just outside the reach of the hallway lights. "You opened it," she whispered. Her voice was raw, dry, like someone who hadn't spoken above a whisper in years. "You shouldn't have opened it." "Who are you?" Jensen asked quietly. The woman glanced behind her, eyes wide. They're not all dead. Not really. Jensen felt her pulse quicken. What do you mean? Where are they? The woman took another step closer, arms trembling. Below. In the quiet. Some of them still talk. In dreams. In the dark, but not like they used to. Her gaze drifted to the ceiling. He listens when you think no one can. Jensen felt the oppressive air return, heavy and clinical. The walls were too smooth, the silence too sharp. This wasn't just a facility, it was an instrument, something designed to study silence, monitor patterns, catalogue trauma. You were one of them? Jensen asked. The woman blinked slowly, then nodded once. Room 2, March 1999. I was the third trial. She reached out suddenly and placed a hand on Jensen's arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. You're in the system now. That means it watches you too. You've changed the outcome, just by being here. From behind them, a low chime sounded. The woman froze. That's the recall, she whispered. They'll come now. Jensen turned to see the corridor lights flashing amber. Another speaker activated overhead. Sequence disruption detected. Reset in progress. All participants return to origin chambers. The woman's eyes filled with tears. Don't let them put me back. Before Jensen could speak, a door to their left unsealed with a hiss. 2 figures stepped out. Not guards, technicians, clad in sterile grey uniforms, faces hidden behind visors, moving with perfect synchronicity. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. One simply raised a small device that emitted a soft frequency tone. The woman shrieked and stumbled back, clutching her head. No! No, please! Jensen stepped between them. Stop! She's coming with me! The technician nearest to her tilted its head slowly, as if confused. Then it spoke in a flat, synthetic voice. You are not authorized to extract test subject. Jensen raised her badge. I'm not asking. The second technician stepped forward and raised the frequency device again. This time, Jensen didn't hesitate. She drew her weapon and aimed it directly at the speaker grill on its chest. I will drop you if you don't step back. A pause. Then, without a word, the 2 figures turned and walked calmly back into the side corridor. The door hissed closed behind them. No resistance, no alarms. It was as if their only objective had been to observe her reaction, or record it. The woman slid to the floor, sobbing quietly. They do that. They test how far you'll go. Jensen knelt beside her. Then let's go farther. She helped her to her feet. Where is the exit? The woman shook her head. There isn't one. Not really. You end when they say you end. That's how it's always been. Jensen looked up. Another corridor had opened, long, white, pulsing with soft blue light. At the end, a massive steel door stood ajar, and beyond it, wind, fresh air, night sky. She looked back once more. Amy's window was still dark, still sealed, but on the glass now, glowing faintly, was a single new word: run. Jensen didn't hesitate. With the pale woman leaning against her shoulder, she stepped into the final corridor. The air changed with every step, warmer, filled with dust and the subtle scent of desert sage. The soft blue light above flickered, casting their shadows long and uneven behind them. The steel door at the end creaked slowly in the breeze. Actual wind, real night. Somewhere, impossibly, this bunker connected to the surface. As they approached the threshold, Jensen kept glancing back. The corridor remained silent. No footsteps, no alarms. Only the echo of the woman's breathing and the memory of that glowing word, run. They emerged into open air. Stars blinked above in a moonless sky, vast and unfamiliar. They were in a basin, surrounded by high, jagged ridges. No buildings, no road. Just an ancient service path leading up through the rocks. The exit, if it could be called that, was nothing more than a reinforced outflow tunnel, half covered in brush and caved-in rock. This place had been hidden intentionally, buried by time and design. Jensen checked her phone. Still no signal. She looked at the woman beside her. "Can you make it?" The woman nodded weakly. "If we stay out, they'll hunt. They always do. But not during daylight. They don't like daylight." Jensen pulled her jacket over the woman's shoulders and began helping her up the slope. Every crunch of gravel underfoot sounded impossibly loud, but the night remained still. Above them, a satellite passed silently across the stars. Somewhere in that void, the rest of the world kept spinning, unaware of what lived beneath the skin of Texas rock. By the time they reached the ridgeline, dawn was beginning to stretch across the horizon. The orange hue lit up the basin behind them. It looked empty now, deceptively peaceful. Jensen scanned the landscape and spotted a rusted fence line in the distance. Beyond it, a road, possibly a highway. The woman collapsed to her knees in the dirt, sobbing. "I haven't seen morning in years." Jensen didn't say anything. She crouched beside her, scanning the terrain for any sign of pursuit, but the hatch behind them remained closed. No dust, no sound. She tapped the emergency GPS transmitter embedded in her watch. Silent, just static. But it was daylight now, and that, for the moment, was enough. They followed the fence line until they reached the road. Nothing passed for nearly 30 minutes. Then, finally, a rusted pickup crested the hill. Jensen stepped into the road, badge held high. The truck screeched to a halt. An old man leaned out, squinting. "You ladies okay?" Jensen nodded once. "We need to call the FBI." 3 hours later, a federal team airlifted them to a secure base near Lubbock. Medical exams were rushed, statements taken. The woman, whose name was eventually confirmed as Rebecca Toller, missing since 1999, was placed under protection. Her story matched the architecture, the procedures, the tests. But some parts of her memory were foggy, as if overwritten or suppressed. She remembered Amy, recalled her voice, her strength. "She kept trying to remind us who we were," Rebecca said, "even when they erased the rest." Jensen was debriefed, tested, then placed under temporary quarantine for psychological evaluation. The Bureau launched a formal investigation into the silos and bunkers. But when they returned to the ridge where Jensen escaped, they found nothing. The outflow pipe was gone. The ridge collapsed. No tunnel, no corridor, just earth. Satellite scans showed only desert, no signs of construction, no anomalies. It was as if the mountain had sealed itself shut. The tapes were archived, the silo files locked away. Publicly, the case remained partially solved. The official statement: the remains of the 4 students were recovered. Foul play suspected. Investigation ongoing. But in Jensen's private report, a different conclusion was scrawled in ink across the final page. This was never just about them. This was a system, built to disappear people, built to study silence. The last line, underlined twice, "and it's still operational."